Find a comfortable position for yourself. Relax your mind. Place your attention on your breathing. So by focusing on your respiration, try to let go of any following of other thoughts. They can all be attended to later. Then bring your attention inward toward your heart area, your heart chakra. Give up watching the breathing. Just be aware of your consciousness, the events within it. Even the distractions, the mental images, all the thoughts that are going through our mind, even though they're present, we can learn to let go of following them, focusing on them, and instead focus on the nature of the mind, which we recognize by their very presence. Those thoughts could not be present unless the mind had an unobstructive nature. They wouldn't be known unless the mind had the function of knowing, cognizing. The mind has no particular color or shape. So if you're observing something in your meditation, some color or shape, that's not the nature of the mind. It's just appearing within the spaciousness of your mind. Even the appearance of your body to your mental consciousness is just an appearance to your mental consciousness. You can let go of that by focusing your attention instead on the state of consciousness that must be its support. The clear light nature within which that appearance is rising. Even the sense of a self appearing to your consciousness is just that, an appearance. We focus on the matrix of the mind, the womb of the mind, within which that's growing, appearing. Within that quiet of the mind, reflect upon our situation. We have a human rebirth with leisure to practice the Dharma. All of the endowments that are necessary to make Dharma realizations, probably lacking none, or perhaps only a facsimile of one. This life is incredibly meaningful because all of the things that we ordinarily strive after, worldly achievements, relationships, pleasure of the senses, success in the world, all of them are fleeting, insubstantial. We can't be satisfied by them. We've had every relationship imaginable in past lives, every pleasure, every success, but still we're looking for more within cyclic existence. The life that we have now has the capacity to take us beyond that kind of mundane striving for the worldly concerns, worldly dharmas. But it too is fleeting, momentary, and we're approaching our inevitable end of this life in every instant, as though we're falling through time. recalling that all of the pleasures of cyclic existence are no more than relief, exchanging one suffering for another, hot for cold, contact for lack of contact. Recognizing that all living beings that are still within cyclic existence are still limited in the same way. Many of those are dependent upon us for their liberation. Directly dependent upon us for their liberation. Many of them indirectly, their enlightenment will be quickened by our achievement of enlightenment. All of them caught up in mundane concerns, their own egos, striving after pleasure but never really finding it, destroying the causes of samsaric pleasure out of anger, wrong views. All our former mothers who have been incredibly, depthlessly kind to us in numberless lifetimes, not knowing the nature of the mind, are caught in this vicious ocean of cyclic existence. I think for once, I'm going to do something for them. I'm going to, this evening, listen to the teachings, participate, contribute, keep alert, even if it takes mental discipline, mental effort, for their welfare, by understanding the mind, I can develop it. I can eliminate all of the faults of my mind, develop all the good qualities. Therefore, I'm going to participate tonight in order to achieve enlightenment. Not for my own sake alone, for the welfare of all living beings, to become less a burden for them, eventually a positive contribution, contributing to their welfare. And then relax. Bring your attention back to the present. So how's your meditation? How's it? Okay? Is it the same week by week or a little bit, getting a little bit better? Or?
It varies day by day. And today was pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Is it vary just all the time like this, or is it going like this, getting a little bit better?
It seems like the first.
It seems like the first. Okay. Now, there's another text I think I mentioned before, besides the text that we're using, Jason Trukey Gelson's text that everyone's been given. There's an excellent book that you can find, Mind in Tibetan Buddhism, that goes over the same subject. And also, did I put this up before? The Mind and Its Function. It's a very good introduction. Not too complicated, but very profound nonetheless. And there's another text I mentioned that dear John Landau just sent over. He had it because he was one of the members that helped translate it originally. It's called A Compendium of Ways of Knowing. It was published by the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, and Venerable Somo has a a store of them over there that she's photocopied from this. So you can purchase some over there. Akya Yongzin was the author, one famous Tibetan, Yangchen Gawe Lodro. Pardon? No, that's a different course. That's the other course.
Oh, this is the Monday night?
Yeah, that's supplementary for Monday night. Okay, different course. So this is interesting. This one, the Tibetan title is Lorigi Domsik Langdor Sawe Melong, a mirror which clarifies what is to be taken up and what is to be rejected. Here it says a clear mirror of what should be accepted and rejected. Lorigi Domsik, a compendium of the ways of knowing. It's interesting, this usually our subject matter is called Lorig, right? And we mentioned that Lo meant awareness in Tibetan. Rik meant knowing or cognizing. But when spelled a different way, when there's a different, although it's pronounced the same, Rik, it's spelled differently, like R-I-G-S. One doesn't say Riks in Tibetan, one still says Rik. When spelled that way, it means type or ways. So Akya Yongzin, instead of calling it awareness and knowing, he took it to mean the ways of knowing, Lo Rik. So there's a little play, a little poetic play, either that's because one of the main subjects are the various ways in which we know things. So if you have a chance to give you an arsenal of other reading to do and to sort of fill in the gaps. So any questions from last time?
We have a few.
Do you have a few? Okay. Throw them out.
I couldn't get what's the difference between appearing objects, determined objects, and objects of engagement?
Oh, gosh. Okay. We'll go over that a little bit more, but yeah, what he said was, what's the difference between appearing object, determined object, and object of engagement? Mm-hmm. So remember we talked about 5 different kind of objects. The text, I think, indirectly mentions them at various points. Maybe at this point it just talked about a fewer number of objects. Some of them are synonymous. So let's take for example a sense awareness, eye consciousness that's perceiving the flower. The flower itself is the appearing object to sense perception. That is the thing which is the main thing appearing. Okay? The flower is also the engaged object because it's that which the mind is actually entering into and knowing. That's another. They're not always the same, the engaged object and the appearing object. But say in the case of a direct perception, when we're knowing something correctly, the engaged object and the appearing object are the same. Now I can't remember how it was here, the beheld object or the apprehended object, the Zungyul, that's the same as the appearing object. And the object of the mode of apprehension is also synonymous with the engaged object. So everything, all 4 of those objects are the same in the case of a sense perception apprehending a flower. The referent object might be different. For instance, if I was perceiving the color of the flower would be the referent object, and the color of the object would be the appearing object and the engaged object, and the other 2 also. Okay. Now, in the case of conception, it's a little bit different. When we have a conceptual consciousness, the way that we're knowing things is via this mode of their appearing to us by some mental image that we develop. Via that mental image. We're actually knowing, it said that we can be knowing the object in some way. We're actually, in the case of me thinking about the flowers, the engaged object is the flower itself. Even though I'm thinking about but the appearing object is not the flower. Although, you might say if you close your eyes, the flowers are still appearing to you. They're not appearing to your eye consciousness. They still, in some sort of subtle way, philosophical way, they're still said to be appearing to the mental consciousness, the conceptual consciousness. But they're not the appearing object, the flowers. The appearing object is what we call a meaning generality of those flowers. Did we talk about that last time? Or mental image? You might have said mental image. Mental image, might not be exactly the best, sort of might give some erroneous understanding to that. If we call the meaning generality or the object generality of the flowers, that is our understanding of flower that has been developed through either conversation before or by directly observing flowers. We have some kind of image in our mind, some kind of understanding of the generality of flower. And we are engaging the actual flowers via that mental image. So the appearing object and the beheld object in that case is this meaning generality. You could say mental image. It's not completely wrong. But it's not a mental image as though, like there's an actual image there that we're looking at, that are the flowers. A little bit, the way that we know things via a mental image is a little bit like how we know things when we look at one of those, what are they called? Little things you had when you were a kid. Were they? Viewmaster. Okay, so everyone knows that it has a name for it. Do you ever have a Viewmaster when you were a kid? And you can have, you can have Eiffel Tower, the Twin Towers in New York. Oops, take that one out. Howdy doody. Is your eye actually focusing on those images in a Viewmaster? What do you think? You knew the Viewmaster. Marcy, really. Is your eye actually focusing on that little image right there? Where does it seem that the image is? Does it seem really small like that, or does it seem big and somewhere out there? Yeah, somewhere out there. It's as though you're looking through that image and you're knowing, let's say, the Eiffel Tower via that image. So it's said that the way that a meaning generality functions is something a little bit like that. It's almost transparent in a sense, and that you are knowing something eventually that you could know with your mind. If you became a Buddha, you could know things directly with your mind. Some things, even before we become Buddha, we can know directly with our mind without the need of this meaning generality, without the need of that little negative or positive there that we're seeing through. Or maybe like rose-colored glasses. Ron, the cook, the other day was, were you here when he had the different glasses, Sarah?
No, but we tried them all at home.
You all tried them on, the red color, green color, sort of. Did you try some, Georgie?
Yeah.
Which ones did you like?
I like the red one.
You like the red one. Okay, I figured you liked the red. Thea would probably like the green ones. The dreamers probably, would you like the blue, maybe you'd like the purple ones, I don't know. Anyway, so you would see through them. You're not actually focusing on the mental image, although that's the principal object that's appearing to you. Okay, the mental image is the principal object that's appearing to you when you have conceptual mind. So if I'm thinking about the flowers are not the appearing object. The mental image, or the meaning generality, more precisely, is what it's called. Donchi, we say in Tibetan. That is the object that's the appearing object, and the beheld object, or apprehended object is another way of translating it. The engaged object is the flowers, and there's another word here, another term here, the determined object that we talk about. There's no determined object when you have sense perception. Here, determined object you could translate maybe as conceived object. The object that you're determining or conceiving of through this vehicle of the mental image. So that, in that case, the determined object is the flowers themselves also. We're said to conceive of or determine the flowers. There is a determined object in conception. And that accounts for most of those, not necessarily the referent object. Let's say when we talk about, say for instance, we conceive of our own personal identity, our own ego identity, the self that Buddhism says doesn't really exist, right? Say we have a conception of that. What's the appearing object to that conception? Does that self actually appear?
Would be the appearance of the body, of the physical body, as an image?
Well, there might be some situations when the body is appearing to your mental consciousness. You have a mental image of that, and you're thinking that might be the self, but that's not the subtlemost one. Usually, it is a sense of self, some kind of appearance to the mind through which you seem to be conceiving of a self. It seems as though, because of the appearance to your mind, it's not necessarily out here. I'm just using that as an example with respect to the eyes, right? The mind is thinking about the self via a mental image of it, a meaning generality of that self that it has determined, it has produced as a result of thinking this lifetime and because of numberless lifetimes' familiarity. So that the appearing object there is the meaning generality of a self, or the mental image of a self. In this case, the determined object, say if I'm believing that self, yeah, there is a self. If I'm believing that, the determined object of that conception is said to be that non-existent self. Did we talk about this last time? The determined object is said to be what you're conceiving of, or we say the conceived object. Like for instance, if you conceive of the horns of a rabbit, there might be in your mind the mental image of the horns of a rabbit. What you're conceiving of, the determined object, is the horns of a rabbit, but such things don't exist. Right? Horns of a rabbit don't really exist, nor does a personal self-identity exist. Am I losing you?
No.
Okay.
So how would you refute that?
Well, first of all, there's some doubt because all of these things that are objects have to exist because it was there were various synonyms for existent things, one of which was object. So if something is an object, it has to exist in general. But there's some exceptions. If something is the object of a conception, like say the conceived object of a conception, an erroneous conception, that object doesn't have to exist. Like I can conceive of my personal self-identity, or I can conceive of the $1 million in my bank account. Oh, wow. I can conceive of that, but it doesn't exist. That can be called a conceived object of that particular conception, conceiving of it, but in general it's not a real object. But it can be called a conceived object in that situation.
Can I trying to put these referent appearing into
Right. We're going.
value on that. I mean, is the referent object the mere cognition of the flower?
No. When we talk about the flower, the referent object is the flower itself. It's not talking about the subject. It's talking about the object. All of these are objects, right?
The flower before I've labeled it or done anything else?
When are you talking about perception or conception here? You're going back to perception, or are you just standing where we are? We're talking about conception. Perception. Going back to perception. The referent object is just the flower. That's what's being referred to or observed. You could call it the observed object.
Okay. The difference between that and the appearing object, which you defined a little bit ago as the generality of the flower.
Don't mix up. That's talking about conception now. There's two different spheres that we're talking about. On one sphere, when we talk about the senses, the object that appears to your senses is the object itself that you're engaging in general. The object that's appearing is the object that you're engaging in a sense-direct perception. But in a conception, in a mental thinking process, if I'm conceiving of you, it's Don, right? If I'm conceiving of Don, I'm thinking, Don's coming to class, Don's a good student. I have some conception of Don. There is a mental image of Don. It actually is technically called the meaning generality of Don, through which I'm knowing Don. I'm conceiving of Don, so Don is the conceived object and the engaged object of that. Now, the reason I brought up the self is it adds now a little more clarity how the referent object could be different. If I'm conceiving of, if I'm conceiving of Don as being truly existent, my true friend, like there's a real soul out there, my soulmate Don, my buddy Don, or Don who owes me $5 or something like that, that's the Don. That Don, I'd really like to get him, he really, like as though I'm really, the mind is projecting some kind of self-identity out there. What is the referent object? The referent object is the actual conventionally existent Don, not the truly existent Don. What I'm referring to, what I'm observing, is the conventionally existent Don, which is merely imputed to his body and mind. That kind of phenomena that conventionally exists. But I'm conceiving of that referent object as truly existent via a mental image of it, or meaning generality, which appears to be, through which I'm misconceiving of the referent object as being truly existent. Now, I've thrown a lot of terms out there. Are you beginning to start? Can you make a little bit of sense of that, Maureen?
Well, then it seems, I guess it's the thing we were talking about last time, that as soon as there's a conception, it can be misunderstood, because it's a mental image. It's no longer
Right, well, in fact,
object.
right, most of the time, when we're perceiving things, we also have conception going along with it. In everyday life, we're looking at Don and we're thinking, Don is my good buddy, at the same time as perceiving him. Maybe they might be taking place simultaneously, maybe alternating the visual perception and the conception. But if we just close our eyes or we're just daydreaming about something else, or our mind is distracted even though we're observing something here, we can be thinking about something completely different. There can be mental images, thinking about things via their mental images in our mind. And those actual things, our mother's face, our friend, where we grew up, those things are not actually appearing to us as in direct perception, but we're still said to be knowing them in some way. This particular tradition of Buddhism says that although conception doesn't have the same power, correct conception doesn't have the same power as direct perception. Like, say, for instance, if we can perceive selflessness with our mental consciousness directly, it's called a yogic direct perception of that. We'll talk a little bit later today. As though you were seeing it with your eyes, seeing an apple in the hand, that clearly. That kind of perception, direct knowing, can clear away the delusion so that they'll never come back again. So in different swaths, we take away different layers of the delusions every time we meditate and have a direct realization of emptiness. It's not something that one does next week necessarily. It's something that takes perhaps many, many lifetimes of preparation if one's on the Bodhisattva path. But still, conception of emptiness or conception of selflessness still gets us to that point Without having first conceived of selflessness or conceived of something, we can't eventually have a mental direct perception of it. So although the conception doesn't have the same power as seeing it directly, the conception is knowing, say I'm knowing Maureen, let's say via a mental image of her. I'm not focusing on the mental image. I'm using the eyes here to represent the mental consciousness. I'm not focusing on that mental image, but I'm knowing Maureen as though I'm seeing Maureen out there via the mental image. So in the case of, say, of conceiving, let's say, of conceiving of Maureen as truly existent, the conventionally existent Maureen that does exist is the referent object, the observed object. The conceived object and the engaged object is a truly existent Maureen, which actually does not exist, but I'm thinking it does. I'm conceiving that such a thing does exist. The appearing object, so can I say the conceived object doesn't really exist? I think I can say that. There is a conceived object, but such a conceived object does not exist. How about the appearing object? Does the appearing object exist? When I'm thinking about Maureen as being truly existent? The appearing object doesn't exist. What is the appearing object?
It's the mental image.
Yeah, that doesn't exist.
It exists in your mind.
Yeah, that exists. That exists. It doesn't accord with reality. It doesn't accord with reality, but it does exist. Whereas the object that I'm thinking exists out there, truly existent Maureen or truly existent, what is it? Stephen. Truly existent Stephen. Such an object as that does not exist at all. That's only something I'm thinking about. But this mental image is said to exist.
When you're using the conceived object, is that the same as the determined object?
Yeah, that's another way of saying, it's another way of translating the very one and the same term.
Sorry, John.
Yeah.
The appearing object exists but not truly.
The appearing object,
The one the meaning generality is the same as the appearing object.
Yeah,
Yes.
right.
That exists but not truly.
well, yeah,
Is that
yeah,
right?
we don't even have to get into that. Of course, ultimately, nothing exists truly, or, ultimately. But it may appear to exist. It may be the appearance of a truly existent Venerable Angie. I may have that appearance, but it's still appearing. It still exists. The appearance exists. Like, say, someone puts up a picture of a caricature of George Bush. Maybe that what's being referred there doesn't exist. Maybe he's got a pitchfork and he's got babies on the pitchfork or something like that, or he's guzzling oil or something like that. The referred to object doesn't exist, but certainly you can't say the image doesn't exist. The character, the picture does exist, but what's being referred to by that does not exist. So the conceived object that one is knowing via that mental image. It's like having a bad, what was it called? The machine? Viewmaster. Like having a bad Viewmaster slide, it's kind of a little wrinkled and it's got maybe the Eiffel Tower is upside down or something like that, or twisted around or something like that.
So we're talking all on the conventional level here, actually.
Yeah, the only reason I bring up talking about selflessness or emptiness is just to show you that there is a difference in the referent object. The referent object is what we're actually referring to or observing. In some cases, it's different than the engaged object. In the case of perception, it's the same. The referent object, or the observed object, is indeed the same as the appearing object, which is indeed the same as the engaged object. How's that fitting in your mind, Chris? Is that too many objects?
I would not eat them in a box. I would not eat them in a box.
Pretty much different than the conceived object.
Of course, there's not a conceived object in perception, right? So that's the determined or conceived object. That's something that only takes place in conception. So in conception, there's one other object that we talk about that we don't talk about in terms of perception, the conceived object. Because the sense consciousnesses, the eye, the ear, the nose, the taste, the tactile sensation, they don't think. Actually, one school does think, one non-Buddhist school, I think the Vaisheshikas, if I'm not mistaken, they believe that there can be conception within the sense consciousnesses. When you hear something beautiful, it's as though the ear consciousness is deciding, that's nice. Or maybe it almost seems like that to us sometimes. We see a nice person walk by and, it's almost as though your eye is deciding that that's nice. That's all done by your mental consciousness. Okay? Okay. Yeah, yeah.
Well,
You missed most of you asked a question and you missed most of the answers. You went out for a break. Okay, it's okay.
no, go ahead.
No, good. What was it? This one you have to stay for, though. If you ask another.
My train is not derailed.
Oh, you're derailed. Okay. Okay. So the point of talking about objects here is to begin to prepare us to talk about the mind, because the various states of mind, in the definitions and the discrimination amongst them, will make reference to these different kinds of objects. A mistaken consciousness, for instance, is one which is wrong or mistaken with respect to its appearing object. That's what a mistaken consciousness is. Something that's mistaken with respect to its appearing object. So, for instance, it's said that all conceptions are said, even ones that know correctly. We can have a conception that realizes emptiness, actually realizes emptiness, okay, a conception. But it's still said to be a mistaken consciousness. Why? Because it's mistaken with respect to its appearing object. The appearing object is actually knowing. Let's say if we're talking about emptiness, there's an appearing object, a mental image of emptiness, a meaning generality of emptiness, by means of which we're knowing actual emptiness, somehow factually correctly. But we're mistaken because although the major thing, the predominant thing that is appearing to us is the mental image of emptiness, we are thinking that that is emptiness, and that's a mistake. We mistake the mental image for the object itself that it represents. So all conceptions, even if they are realizations, even if they are prime cognitions, are said to be mistaken in that way. So this is why when we talk, there's a reason for going into this detail about all of these different objects, because as we go back, as further on when we go through the different kinds of consciousness, we'll be referring to them. So don't worry, even if you don't, right now it seems like, oh, there's so many. Later, when we go through the definitions, you'll get familiar with them again, and you can go back at that time. Some people will study it now and try to get it down. Other people, like myself, more lazy, later, that's too come. I'll just get on to like my teacher Lama Yeshe, when he passed away, before he passed away, when he wanted to learn how to drive, he never wanted, when you get in the car, someone who was going to give him a driving lesson, Lama wouldn't, as soon as he turned the key, he wanted to start driving. He didn't want to have any instruction, he just wanted to do it. And I noticed when I taught Lama Yeshe's reincarnation, Lama Osel, whenever we got some new computer or computer game or a toy or something, he never wanted to read the instruction book. He just wanted to do it immediately. So maybe you just want to get on to, you just want to do low rig. You don't want to worry about all of this stuff. But you'll have to, sooner or later you'll go back and you'll study about these objects again. Okay. So we went over a lot of this last time, and maybe we'll go over, as the class progresses, maybe there's something else that'll come back, and I'll come up and I'll go back to this again. So whatever exists, like on the page 9, the second paragraph from the bottom, or sort of set off. It says, whatever is an established base is necessarily the object of the mode of apprehension of both a conceptual and a non-conceptual consciousness. That is to say, whatever is an established base, it's another way of saying whatever exists, because established base is a synonym of existent. Anything that exists is an established base. So whatever is existent is necessarily the object of the mode of apprehension, or in other words, the engaged object, is known by both a conceptual and a non-conceptual consciousness. How can that be? Subtle, atom in the middle of the Gobi Desert, or something. What consciousness knows that directly? Oh, the omniscient mind. There are numberless Buddhas whose omniscient mind know all phenomena. So whatever exists can be known both by direct perception and by inference. Everything that exists, according to these tenets, however, is not necessarily the appearing object of direct perception. Now get down to the nitty-gritty here. Everything that exists is not necessarily the appearing object of direct perception. You remember what we said before? If something was the appearing object of direct perception, it had to be what? It had to be impermanent. In fact, it was synonymous with impermanent. Anything which is impermanent is necessarily the appearing object of direct perception. Anything which is permanent is necessarily the appearing object of conception. And the appearing object of conception is also itself permanent, we said. How do we know, let's say selflessness. What is selflessness? Is selflessness impermanent or permanent? Emptiness or selflessness? Do you know, Jimmy? Do you know, is selflessness permanent or impermanent? Emptiness. Is emptiness permanent or impermanent?
I kind of find it in between.
The middle way. Okay. That's a good answer. Okay.
No,
I forgot your name.
Alicia.
Alicia. Oh, yeah.
Is it impermanent because it arises with the object and goes away when the object goes away?
What do you think? Does that mean that's impermanent?
I would say permanent.
Actually, that's a good guess. Yeah.
No, because it's always selfless.
While it's there, it's always selfless. It's not changing. Partially selfless, partially non-selfless. Right.
It's always selfless.
It's part. So how would you rephrase Alicia's answer? She said, "Isn't it impermanent because it comes into existence when the person comes into existence and goes out of existence when the person dies? The selflessness of the person." How would you explain to her that that's still impermanent? Do you remember the distinction we made last time?
That it's still permanent, you mean?
Yeah. Because she said it sounded to her like it was impermanent because it comes into existence and goes out of existence.
But it's always empty.
While it's existent, it's always permanent, right?
Uh-huh.
So remember we talked about something that was called a temporary permanent, something that can, like the emptiness of this cup comes into existence when the cup is made and goes out of existence when the cup is broken or destroyed. There's a difference between eternal and permanent. Just because something is not eternal doesn't mean that it's not permanent. Something can be can last just a certain amount of time and still be permanent. What? Why is that? I don't know, just the way it is. I don't know, what do you mean? There's a difference between impermanent. Here, impermanent means momentary. That means something which is impermanent disintegrates in every moment, and what appears the next instant is something which is the continuity of that previous instant, like the cup. The cup is impermanent, not only in the way that we might think of in Western science, that the atoms are vibrating and the molecules are vibrating or something like that, but its very existence to our consciousness is due to our karma. And every instant, it's the appearance of that, although it seems the same as the previous instant, is actually different. The object that we're referring to is different, and our perception, our karmic appearance of it is different. So impermanent phenomena are said to be momentary, in that they, like our consciousness, every instant it arises, the next instant of consciousness arises as a result of the previous instant of consciousness. Sometimes different. This is slightly different in every instant. We are slightly different in every instant, although the change is so minute that we don't notice it. If you were to perceive, if you looked in the mirror, and tomorrow when you're brushing your teeth, and you saw your face as it would be when you were 80 years old, you'd be shocked. You'd think, oh, suddenly changed. When your tooth falls out or something, you think, oh, actually it's been falling out all along. But we only notice it when something gross changes. We don't notice the momentary impermanence. We only notice, at most, gross impermanence, if we notice that. That's why we meditate on death, in order to try to understand subtle impermanence. Because without understanding gross impermanence, there's no way that we can understand subtle impermanence. Mr. Georgie.
So, is the cup impermanent, but its emptiness is permanent? Is that right? Is that right?
I think that's right. Yeah. The cup is impermanent.
The idea of cup. What about the concept of cup?
What about the concept of cup? Okay. What do you mean by the concept of cup? What I'm conceiving of.
I'm thinking about a cup.
Okay.
In general, a cup.
I'm thinking about cup.
Okay.
Is the
Good.
concept itself, that is a mental state, right? I'm conceiving of cup.
Yeah.
That concept has to be impermanent. I'm conceiving of cup. But how I'm conceiving of cup, the appearing object of that conception is a mental state,
Right.
knowing. And that's changing moment by moment. But what I'm knowing, let's say, for instance, if I'm conceiving of the cup, there is a mental image that I'm knowing that cup by. That mental image is permanent, it's said.
And where is that stored, or does it have a stored place, or what is?
That's in the second drawer on the left. Just take a look. Wait, open it up. Okay. It arises in our mind. Perhaps it's it's related to memory, and whenever we conceive of something, that mental image that we have developed, and we'll talk more about it later. Maybe meaning generality is a better term to use or object generality. The generality of an object. We say dunchi in Tibetan. That comes about through some kind of experience, either direct experience of something or indirect experience, like someone describing to you what, I don't know, who Robert Redford looks like or something, they tell you what he looks like. And then when you actually see him, maybe he looks completely different than you thought. You had a different mental image that wasn't based, it was only a mental image based on language, on having something described to you. Other mental images can be experiential, actually based on having seen something or experienced it in some way, and knowing your mental image of that, in a sense, is perhaps more vibrant, more reliable. Do you follow what I mean? Like having seen the Eiffel Tower rather than just having it described to you.
The mental image, the mental image, why is that meaning generality of the cup or the Eiffel Tower or whatever, why is that permanent? 'Cause it seems like it would be probably changing one image and then it probably change every time you see them.
So this question, the great Yogi Dorje asked last time also. but I don't know if you checked. Did you check? Why? You didn't probably, you're too busy with,
Such a bad student.
you're making prostrations and doing other kinds of preliminary practices. So this whole subject of why the meaning generality is said to be permanent is very complicated. But it's said that in the way that our Gelugpa tradition understands Dharmakirti and Dignaga is that the way that we know, the way that we conceive of things, like for instance, you see two dogs. Mommy taught you this was dog. And then you see another dog. Maybe you notice this with your kids, right? You taught them one dog, and then they see another dog, and they say, dog. They see one fire engine, and then they see a different one, and they say, fire engine. Remember we were talking about this last time? Or no? We can start to see things that are similar, and we give name, we have language. Our whole language depends upon conception, our conceiving of things. And the names that we give, cup or mug, actually, this mug is different than this mug, right? But we still call them mug. We conceive of and use the language of generalities in our life, but we haven't really investigated it very well, what those generalities refer to. Generalities, to one of the great Buddhist logicians, Dignaga, one of the famous ones, generalities were necessarily permanent phenomena. They didn't have any kind of correspondence to something that was real. They themselves were just some imaginary thing by which we found a correspondence, similar correspondence between things. A generality always has particulars or instances of which it is the generality. Like mug, the generality of mug has many particularities or instances. Actually, there's a whole bunch of words for different. There's a word for particularity. There's a word for instance. When we talk about it later in language and Buddhist understanding of language, which is very, very important because from the higher school's point of view, all phenomena are merely imputed by concepts or names, right? And so the study of that is very crucial to understanding reality. So how do we generate a generality, a concept of a generality? Because it's a conceptual construct. You can't show me a general cup, which is not a particularity of cup. Because there's two different things. There's generality and particulars. A generality has to be different than its particulars, but if it is a particular, it has to be that generality. Like if it's a particular dog, it has to be dog. Say dog is the generality, okay? If it is wolf, is that your dog's name? Wolf? No. Was it? Zuni. I thought it was wolf.
He is a wolf.
Oh, he is a wolf. Okay, it's not a dog. Okay. That's why I said he is a wolf. It's not a dog. Okay, let's say wolf is generality. Then Zuni is one particularity or instance of wolf. Where can you find wolf, though? The generality wolf that is different. It's just a concept that we develop. How do we develop it? It's said that the means by which we develop it is an indirect one, in which we know of, like say we see wolf, and we know everything that's not wolf. This is not wolf. Once we've seen wolf, we know this is not a wolf, right? We know this is not a wolf. Theoretically, we know a dog is not a wolf, but obviously that doesn't necessarily work because I thought Zuni was a dog. It's actually a wolf, okay? So we know of things that are non-wolf. The opposite of non-wolf is the way that we get at the generality wolf. It's called one way of saying it is you could say the opposite of non-wolf, or the reverse of non-wolf. When we talk about in Tibetan Buddhism, when we studied a previous course in the monasteries, there's this topic some of you have heard of, maybe who was here might have heard of. You've probably heard of Ingrid Dokpa, or Venerable, you've heard of Dokpa, no? Reverse or isolate. Diane, right?
Yeah.
Diane, or Diana.
Diana.
Diana had asked in the break, what's the meaning of this word that comes in a lot of the debates that sometimes we're skipping over? Pervasion. I made a point to say it doesn't mean perversion. Pervasion, in case you think. So it has to do, it's a logical term. The Tibetan word is kyapa. In debate, that's one of the possible answers in debate. There's a certain formalism of debate. Someone proposes an argument to you. They propose a consequence or they propose a syllogism to you, and you have only a certain number of answers. One of the answers is kyapa majong. Kyapa means pervasion, so that means there's no pervasion. Like, for instance, I might say, Zuni is a wolf because he's a male. Is that true? Well, Zuni's a male, Zuni's a wolf. Come on. There's no pervasion that if you're a male, you're a wolf, right? Chris is a male, he's not a wolf. I'm a male, I'm not a wolf. Pervasion means that something would necessarily be covered. Like if you think of set theory, there's a certain, if something is pervaded by something, that means every instance of that can be found in a greater set. You know what I mean by set? Yeah, like say if you're in grade school, high school, nowadays they learn when they're in kindergarten, I think, Venn diagrams. Not Zen diagrams, Venn diagrams. Maybe Zen diagrams also. Maybe it's in Japan. Venn diagrams. You remember, Georgia? Did you study Venn diagrams?
I was such a bad student.
Okay. You studied Zen diagrams, I think. Yeah. You studied Zen diagrams. Okay. So Venn diagrams, there are different kinds of sets of things that can be indicated diagrammatically, and where two sets might overlap. Where they overlap, there was certain things in common, So if something, say for instance, if this was a set and it was fully within one of these sets, would say this set pervaded this. That means every instance of this has to be within this set, if it's a pervasion. Kind of, you can think of it that way also. So we were mentioning that in logic, and this is something we'll learn more as we're going along, in debate, there's a certain, when we talk about a logical statement of an inference, of a syllogism, like say for instance, sound, the subject sound is impermanent. That statement is the predicate. There's a subject, a predicate, and a sign, and usually an example. The subject sound, predicate, is impermanent. Sign, because it's a product. Maybe example, like a pot. Okay. A pot is also impermanent because it's a product. An example has to be something you can understand the relationship between the sign and the predicate more easily than you can with the subject. Sound is more difficult to understand that it's impermanent. Okay, so let's take, without using the example, let's say another example of a syllogism, a logical argument is, on a smoky pass. That's the subject. On a smoky pass. Predicate. Fire exists. Sign. Because smoke exists. You notice I didn't say smoke existing on a pass, I said a smoky pass, so that verbally that's legitimate. On a smoky pass, fire exists because smoke exists. sign, example, like a smoky kitchen.
But wouldn't that only be through reference?
It's only by inference. Yeah, inference. In fact, that's what this is. This can give rise to an inference in your mind, an inferential cognition that knows that fact. But sometimes you have to tell it, we often use inferences in our own life to prove to ourselves that something is true. Okay? But we have to have a correct inference. So one of the elements that's necessary, there's three. A correct inference has to have three, what they call three modes. There have to be three things present. There has to be what's called the property of the subject. That is, the subject of the syllogism, let's say on the smoky pass, has to be the sign. On a smoky pass, smoke exists. Is that true?
Yes.
That's true. Okay. Or sound is impermanent because it's a product. Sound is a product. Does it have the property of the subject? Is that true? It does have the property of the subject because sound is indeed a product. But then, in addition to that, you have to have two privations. You have to have what's called the forward privation and the reverse privation. The forward privation in a syllogism is that if it's the sign, it's necessarily the predicate. Or in other words, the sign pervades the predicate. What would that be? In this case, on a smoke exists where fire exists. Right? Where there's smoke, there has to be fire. In fact, that's what we often say, isn't it? Where there's smoke, there's fire. Isn't that what your dad told you when you came in and there was chocolate all over your face and the brownies were gone? Where there's smoke, there's fire. Okay? Why don't we say where there's fire, there's smoke? It doesn't work that way. There's not a privation where there's fire, where there's smoke. You can have some fires without smoke, but where there's smoke, actual smoke, I don't mean dust of the horses' hoofs of Tonto and the Long Ranger going by. Actual smoke, that has to have come from fire. Okay? Then there has to be the reverse privation. The reverse privation is the opposite of the predicate pervading the opposite of the sign. That is to say, which one are we doing here? In Smoky Pass, fire exists. So where no fire exists, no smoke exists. That's reverse privation. Actually, in general, if a syllogism, if a logical argument has the forward privation, it will also have the reverse privation. So in theory, you don't have to prove both, but it's said that you have to have all three modes. So that's where that term privation, there is no privation, because someone might have said something to you, like they might have said, Zuni is a wolf because he's a male. And your answer would be, Kyapa Majung. There's no privation. That would be one of the possible arguments that you could say. Another thing you could say is Tagmaju. Tak means sign. Remember these three elements, the subject, the predicate, and the sign. Tak means sign. So Tagmaju means the sign is not established. That would mean there's not the predicate, there's not the property of the subject, for one thing. That, like we say, Zuni is a wolf. So Zuni is a wolf because he's a male didn't work for you. So I say, okay, no, Zuni is a wolf because she's a girl. And you say, excuse me, Tagmaju. The sign is not established. Zuni is not a girl. Zuni is not a female. So there's a different answer you would use in different cases. This is just giving a very simple example. Okay? Using Zuni. So Zuni has become very famous tonight. Okay. Georgie? Yeah.
Other than emptiness, what is not a product?
There's numberless. What is not a product would be permanent phenomena, right? They're numberless permanent phenomena. Generalities are permanent, Space is permanent. Cessation is permanent, when we talk about true cessations. And in the Abhidharma Kosha, there's a famous verse in the first chapter, I think it says, space and the two cessations are permanent. It doesn't talk about selflessness or emptiness there, but one almost is led to that conclusion even in the Hinayana tenets that selflessness is a permanent phenomena. But they say space, which is the absence of obstructing contact. Remember we talked last time? And the two cessations here means analytical cessations, which are actually what we talk about when we talk about true cessation. Like when you, on the path of seeing, when we talk about the arhats and the Arya beings that have ceased affliction so that they'll never come back again into their mind streams, those are called true cessations. They're ceased from the root so that they'll never come back again. Analytical cessations are not exactly the same. They're, you might say, temporary cessations. You know, like for instance, I don't think this is exactly an example of a non-analytical cessation. Analytical cessations are real cessations. Non-analytical cessations are things maybe like this. I don't think this is a good example, but maybe like this. When there is attachment in the mind, anger is ceased. It doesn't mean that anger is ceased forever from the root, but because you have some other state temporarily there, it can't manifest at that moment. Okay, so there's lots of things that are permanent. In fact, there have to be more permanent things than there are impermanent things. Because every impermanent thing, it has its emptiness. And that emptiness has its emptiness. So you've already got two. And then that has its emptiness too. And so you have to have, numberless permanent things for every impermanent thing. Maybe you can find some flaw with that, I don't know.
So a cessation isn't produced then?
A cessation is not produced, because if something is produced, it's a product, and therefore it comes about because of causes and conditions. So in the Four Noble Truths, the cessation, the truth of cessation, the third noble truth, there's a truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering, the truth of cessation, the truth of the path. Truth of cessation means true cessations, analytical cessations. Those are permanent phenomena. Once something has been ceased from the mind, it doesn't oscillate, kind of half there, half not. It's gone. It's ceased. But that cessation itself is a permanent phenomena, and it doesn't have a cause. But it does arise because of conditions such as the true path. So sometimes, it'd be a topic of your term paper or something in high school or college or something. You can say that true paths are causes of true cessations, only in a general way, not in a specific way. They're not really causes of true cessations, because true cessations are permanent. And anything that's permanent doesn't have a cause. Things that are permanent still are dependent arisings, though. Does that throw you for a loop? Because sometimes we think dependent arisings are necessarily impermanent. No, that doesn't mean dependent arisings are not necessarily impermanent, right? Did you write down? Dependent arising, there are different meanings of dependent arising. Dependent arising in its more extensive sense doesn't mean just arising in dependence on causes and conditions. That kind of dependent arising is a product. But in a more subtle sense, dependent arising, all phenomena are dependent arisings. Even permanent phenomena are dependent arisings, because they arise in dependence on a consciousness, a basis of designation, and a name or a concept designated to that. Cessation is a dependent arising, because it arises, its only existence is one which is nominal, conventional. The only existence, conventional existence, is one that's nominal, imputed by a consciousness, thinking about something, thinking about a basis, and imputing a name to that. So even Emptiness is a dependent arising. All phenomena, this, when you talk about Nagarjuna's final intention, it's always that emptiness and dependent arising are co-dependent, are inferring one another. You could say interdependent. They do not contradict, but actually affirm one another, like in the Lama Chopa Puja that we do every month that says like that. That's to understand that there's no contradiction between emptiness and dependent arising is one of the hallmarks of a correct understanding of emptiness, etc. Anyway, this is getting us a little off the field. But just, we'll talk more about syllogisms as time goes on, and we'll talk about some of these debates. So let's just go a little bit further. So, self, I, person, and being are synonymous. Actually, there's many other synonyms of this. Self is a Tibetan word, maybe dak. I is a Tibetan word, nga. You ever hear that? Nga drogi, I am going, nga. Person is kangsak. So person doesn't mean like a human being. Even a cow or a cockroach is a person. A bardo being is a person. And being here is kebu in Tibetan. All of these are synonymous. Self here, I think, is what we say dak, the Sanskrit word for that is atma. You've probably heard of that, right? Sometimes translated as self or soul. Okay. So an illustration is a being who possesses a basis of one of the three realms. A basis here means a body, or a body and mind of the three realms. What are the three realms? What are they? America, desire realm, form realm, formless realm. Okay, we'll talk more about that. So the definition, so this is the main, now we get to the main nitty-gritty here. The definition of an awareness is, so this is lo. The word like lo-rig. Lo, the definition of lo is rik, rikpa, knower, or cognition. This word, the lo-rik. There's synonyms actually. So the definition of an awareness, any kind of awareness that we have, is something which is a knower. It knows. Another way, although it's synonymous with that, consciousness, shepa, that's the next thing. The definition of a consciousness in Tibetan is this word shepa, S-H-E, maybe you could say shepa. Definition of a consciousness is that which is clear and knowing. Do you know, anyone know this definition in Tibetan? Angie, do you know? Where did Venerable Ingrid go? She was off to do puja. Anyone know? Sel Shing Rikpa. Selwa means clear, or clarity, selwa, like my guru's reincarnation's name, Lama Usel. Means light, sel means clear, clear light, Usel. Sel Shing means and, Rikpa means knowing. So the definition of a consciousness is that which is clear in knowing. So that distinguishes consciousness perfectly, that which is clear and knowing. It doesn't mean clear like clear day or something else. It has a very particular meaning, like when we're looking at the nature of the mind. The clarity of the mind has several different levels of subtlety. On one level, it means its unobstructive nature. It does not prevent thoughts from coming into it. Its nature is completely non-obstructive, nor is it obstructed by thoughts in it. You know, they say, I can't change my mind, I've got anger in my mind. No, that doesn't obstruct your mind, the fact that a conscious state is present. That itself is not obstructing. Consciousness is not obstructive to anything, as opposed to material matter. Basically, here, let's go an aside for a second. One of the subjects that would have been studied if we had studied collected topics, the Dura text. are the three kinds of impermanent phenomena. There are three categories of impermanent phenomena. That which is material, or matter, form. That which is consciousness, completely different. There's no overlap between consciousness and form. Our consciousness is not our brain that's comprised of atoms and molecules. It's of a different continuum. What's the third kind of impermanent phenomena? Do you know? Can you think of something else that's impermanent, which is neither form nor consciousness? Because certainly form is impermanent, right? In all of its manifestations, colors, shapes, wind, sun, atoms.
Formation.
What is it?
Karmic formation.
Karmic formations, you could say compositional factors. Actually, what we say are, in this case, it would be a particular subset of that called non-associated compositional factors. Not associated with the mind. Because some compositional factors are consciousness itself. Like in the five aggregates, the fourth aggregate is called compositional factors. That includes all the mental factors. Those are consciousness. But there's this kind of compositional factor that is not associated with the mind. Can you think of something that's impermanent like that?
Is time?
There you go. Time's an example. Time is something which is impermanent, but it is not consciousness. Time itself is not conscious, is not material. Also, person. A person is impermanent. Like, I forgot, what's your first name? Mark. Mark is an impermanent phenomena, so he has to be one of the three. He has to be either matter, consciousness, or non-associated compositional factor. Is Mark consciousness? Well, Mark is imputed onto a combination of body and mind. So Mark, the impermanent phenomena that conventionally exists, Mark, is not mind itself, exactly. It's not matter, although it's comprised of matter. Also, one of his aggregates is a form aggregate, but is a third category which is neither form nor consciousness, called non-associated compositional factor. So there are three kinds of impermanent phenomena. And consciousness here is that which is clear in knowing. The clarity can refer to its non-material nature. It is not, consciousness itself does not have any continuum that can be created out of matter. You take a bunch of, plutonium atoms or something and you put them together somehow and consciousness comes out. Or you make the brain in the laboratory and then consciousness is there because the material somehow causes the consciousness. It's not to say that consciousness can't support, it is not to say that matter cannot support consciousness. It does have a relationship with consciousness. Our brain does help to support, like the pathway through which consciousness can travel, kind of like the LA freeways. Okay? And if there's an earthquake and the LA freeway falls down, it's like having a lobotomy or something, right? Or an accident. The brain has been crushed. So obviously the pathway, it's not as though the mind has been directly destroyed, but the pathways through which the mind travels are altered in some way. Same thing when you take aspirin or drugs or something. There might be some kind of mental change that's appeared. It doesn't change the mind directly. It changes either the pathway or the vehicle of the mind, the prana upon which the mind moves. So here, clear can mean many different things. You can read in Lati Rinpoche's book other kinds of possibilities. It can mean non-material. It can mean the ability of mind to take on the aspect of whatever appears to it, like the reflective quality, the clarity of a mirror. Also, when we do Mahamudra meditation, when we try to meditate on the nature of the mind, just to try to recognize that nature, the clear nature of the mind. Non-obstructiveness, non-material, reflective nature. And the function of consciousness is to know. It's different than the clarity, say, of these glasses or the clarity of a crystal. But it does have some similarity to that, the word clarity. But the function of consciousness, unlike a crystal or the glasses, even though they're clear they have a certain clarity, and they might take on the aspect of something that you place them in contact with. You know, you can see that color through the crystal clarity. The lens of my glasses don't know the object. Consciousness has the function of knowing, of cognizing, that which is clear and knowing. So there are three synonyms, two of which were in the first definition of awareness. Awareness is this Tibetan word lo. And awareness, the definition of awareness is a knower. That's rikpa. Consciousness, the second definition, the definition of a consciousness is shepa. So these three, lo, rikpa, and shepa, awareness, knower, and consciousness, are synonymous. That means they refer to one and the same thing. Actually, they're different words, and they are conceptually different, but they are still said to be synonymous. Okay, so when awarenesses are divided, there are different ways of dividing. Like I sometimes mention about mind, it's like having a pie. You can divide the pie many different ways, right? You can divide it like down the middle into slices, pie-shaped slices, or you can cut it up boy style with a spoon. You just toss everything out. Or you can put it squared, and then some people get little teeny pieces, and then mom and dad get the big pieces, or maybe the kids get the big pieces because they cut it that way. We all got a piece. I cut them, you know. You can divide mind up in many different ways. When it says, when awarenesses are divided, there are two, that's just one particular way. In fact, this is one of the topics of the text, all the different ways that you can divide minds. In one way of dividing minds, there's two kinds, prime cognizers and non-prime cognizers, or you can say non-prime awarenesses, synonymous. Prime cognizer is this word that we talked about the other day, pramana. Did any of you remember that word, pramana? Pramana is an Indian word, Sanskrit word, that means, can mean valid. Here it's taken as prime. They're using prime cognizer here. Prime, yeah, like primary, first. Prime also can mean kind of best, isn't it? Like prime rib or something like that, right? Primo. Man, primo. So what does this mean? Prime cognizers and non-prime awarenesses. A prime cognizer, or let's say a pramana, or a valid cognizer, this is another way of translating it according to the higher schools. They wouldn't translate pramana as prime. They take the pra as meaning main. Pramana, something which knows its main object. Here, according to these tenets, lower tenets, pra means new, like primary, first. Something which is fresh, knows something newly. Pramana. So the basic meaning of a valid cognizer is something which has realized its object. Or, in other words, which is incontrovertible. What does that mean, incontrovertible? This is just one way of translating the word. Direct perception. That's not what incontrovertible means. There we go. Now we're getting, so correct, she's doing kind of literally, incontrovertible. Controvertible would mean what? Something you could overturn, you could show to be incorrect. Incontrovertible, it is incontrovertible, what? What's incontrovertible? That all phenomena are selfless, right? What would you say? It is incontrovertible, indisputable, well, indisputable, slightly different. But incontrovertible, I was just trying to find an example in everyday life. Do we ever use that word? Do you ever use that?
The red is red. Did you say that?
That roses are red? Oh no, come on.
Red is red.
That red is red, yeah. I mean, it's incontrovertible that, what do they say? There's nothing certain but, what is it, taxes and death? What is it? Death and taxes? Something like that. Nothing. Incontrovertible here means a consciousness that's incontrovertible means one which has eliminated all of the wrong superimpositions about something and has gotten at something correctly. It has realized it correctly. That can be a conceptual mind too. It doesn't have to be only perception. Certainly you would say a perception can be a valid cognizer, right? When you have an eye, if your eyes aren't, faulty, you can actually have an incontrovertible perception of this flower. That's correct. You can also have, with a certain kind of mental, a certain kind of conceptual mind, you can also have an incontrovertible prime cognizer through a particular kind of conception that we call inferential cognition. Excuse me. When we were talking about logic before, a certain state, a certain logical argument that you think about, you meditate on, sound is impermanent because it's a product. You can actually realize, have a valid cognition, a prime cognizer, that sound is impermanent through that kind of logical argument. And having established to yourself that sound is a product, that something is a product, it's necessarily impermanent, and so forth.
Would intuition have something, could intuition be a part of this mechanism as well?
What intuition is, well, maybe we'll have to investigate what intuition is.
Okay,
Intuition, no, this is worth investigating. Intuition, we use the word a lot in the West as though we know what it is, but what is intuition?
It is a type of knowing.
Okay, let's say it is a kind of knowing, is an awareness that we're labeling intuition. What are its qualities? Is intuition always correct? It's always correct when we think it's always correct when in the end my intuition was right. But sometimes it's wrong. My intuition was wrong, right? So it's kind of like a guess, isn't it? But we think sometimes we may have without some logical reasons presented to us, we have a feeling that we may have some intuition, we use the word intuition, we may have some tap onto what's going to happen, let's say, or what's happening now at a distant place. There may be some validity that certain kinds of understanding can arise because of karma, because of certain kind of clairvoyance. So there may be some causes for intuition, but perhaps a lot of what people call intuition is just what we'll learn later to be belief. It can be correct belief, but it's just a belief, I have an intuition it's going to rain today. It might be based on some evidence, and then so it's hard to say what intuition is. It's a word that we use a lot in the West, though.
I don't know if intuition is really a guess. I think people use it as a guess, but I think that you have real intuition. It is correct, and it isn't a false knowing. Intuition, I think, turns out correctly. I don't know.
But what if it's wrong? What if it's wrong?
No, then it isn't intuition.
Okay, well, that's the point I was saying before. If it's not right, then you say, oh, it wasn't an intuition.
Yeah.
But if it is right, how do you know that it was an intuition and wasn't just a guess or belief that turned out to be right? I think the White Sox are going to win the first game of the season.
That's not an intuition.
I have an intuition. I'm sorry, that's an intuition.
No. Not necessarily.
Okay, something we can investigate, because it's not something which is a term that has a exact Tibetan equivalent. So we'll just have to investigate as we go along, see if you can What Thea brought up and what you're bringing up now are good points. So we just have to try to figure out how that maps to the terminology we're talking here. It's not as though it's not. It is some state of consciousness because we have some kind of state of awareness that we call intuition in some cases. But is that really a prime cognizer? Does that get at its object and know it, realize it? We'll have to check. Okay. So let me just mention a little bit more. On the next page, on page 13, the second line down, there's a reason for this. This is an argument, but it's the definition of something being incontrovertible, a consciousness being incontrovertible. The definition of something's being an incontrovertible consciousness is a knower which gets at its object of analysis. Gets at, that means it finally, having analyzed something, it actually achieves that goal of the analysis and figures it out correctly. Incontrovertible. Another way of saying incontrovertible, an incontrovertible consciousness is one which has eliminated superimpositions about that thing. It, like all the wrong ideas about it. A synonym of something which is incontrovertible is something which has ascertained its object. Have you ever heard that term before? To ascertain? It means to make certain, ascertain. To ascertain something means to, it's talking about a mental operation in which you have realized something, you've become incontrovertible with respect to something, you've ascertained it. To realize is different than to think about. Pardon?
Conventionally? Realize the object in a conventional sense?
Well, ultimately there's no realization, so it has to be conventional, right? A conventional sense, we've realized something. A realization means, for instance, to have realized the value of perfect human rebirth, the rebirth of leisure and endowment. What would be a sign of that realization? What would that mean to realize it? Would it mean that you read the book and said, yeah, I've got that. I realize that.
Renunciation and practice?
Well, no, I said, what does it mean to realize it, first of all? It means that one has not just understood the words verbally, but one has analyzed that, eliminated all misconceptions, and actually had some kind of experience of that, the truth of that. Eliminated misconceptions. One has an incontrovertible consciousness. One has gotten at that object, eliminated all misconceptions. A person that's realized the value of the perfect human rebirth would not be someone who wastes time. They would, knowing the value of this rebirth, given the value, given the opportunity to have $1 million, $1 billion, or to, for the rest of your life, working and for some job or many, many years, you say, oh, excuse me, this perfect human rebirth is worth far more than $1 billion, trillion dollars. To realize impermanence doesn't simply mean to think, I am impermanent, I'm going to die. It's something which has used a line of reasoning. I, George, am going to die because, and then using various reasons. The Lord of Death comes to everyone and there's no way to escape him. That's one logical reason one can use. At the time of death, there's no extra time, and the time we have left to live is constantly decreasing. Those are logical reasons you can use to prove that you're going to die. When you use a logical reasoning like that, you can realize that, you can eliminate misconceptions about it, and all of the superimpositions that we have that prevent us from really seeing that clearly. Same thing with emptiness. You can realize that all phenomena are empty, or you can realize the self is selfless, the conventionally existent self, conventionally existent Don or Dorje or Oma or Chris. The conventionally existent person is empty of a truly existent person. There are different stages that we go about in developing a realization. First of all, you might have a wrong view. Later, you might have a doubt. Maybe, first of all, you think, oh, the self does exist. And maybe that can change into a doubt. Oh, maybe the self doesn't exist. Maybe it does. I'm not sure. Then that can develop into a belief. The self is selfless. I am selfless. There is no self. But that's just a presumption, a correct belief. Maybe like intuition in some cases. It's only when you reach the point of inference, first of all, an inferential cognizer, that you can actually realize that the self is empty of a truly existent person. That you are selfless, or that things are really impermanent. It's only when you have an inference, that's when you can have the first valid cognizer, valid or prime cognition that is incontrovertible. So next time we're going to talk about that, and if you go up to page 14, you'll see a little more than halfway down the page, there's a little bit of space there. It says, in our own system, the definition of a prime cognizer is, that's sort of the Rangluk, our own system, right? So from there, for the next 3 pages, 4 pages, maybe 5 pages, is all our own tradition. So if you get familiar with that next time, read some of the other peripheral reading, the other books, Compendium of Ways of Knowing. You can get, Venerable Somo has a whole bunch of them back there. How much are they, Venerable? How much? 360. 3 rupees and 60 paisa. And Mind and Its Function, and Mind in Tibetan Buddhism, along with this text. And then, we'll continue next time. So let's take a moment to try to dedicate the merits, put a cap on our experience tonight. See if you can, again, try to find what little calm that we found at the beginning. Even in the chaos of all the thoughts, letting go, seeing through them, rather than focusing on the objective thoughts, focusing instead on the subjective mind, the clear and knowing entity of our mental consciousness. I think directly what you can be perceiving is the clarity of the mind. Perhaps indirectly you're knowing it is cognizing, because the consciousness itself is knowing that phenomena. But you're actually perceiving the clarity of the mind, its non-obstructiveness, its ability to give rise to whatever presents itself to the mind. Arise in an aspect of that. This clear light, like the sky at dawn after the rains, the summer rains have washed out the dirt, the monsoon, and the air, totally lucid before the vibration of the sun is given any color to the sky, as though you could see forever. I think this evening I've created some roots of virtue by motivating at the beginning, and performing the activity of listening to the class with that continuity of motivation, listening to the teachings, thinking about the mind as an object to be investigated for the benefit of others. These roots of virtue will definitely ripen as something pleasurable, relief within cyclic existence. They can't cause suffering, but I'm going to try to dedicate them in such a way that they will enhance my spiritual development and lead to eventually my enlightenment. Dedication is the act of aspiring, trying to make a link that these wishing, praying, that these particular merits ripen in that way. Due to these merits, may I quickly become a Buddha, a Guru Buddha, because that's the real meaning of Buddha. All Buddhas are teachers, are gurus. All gurus are manifestations of the Buddha potential within us. All sentient beings.